The war between Russia and Ukraine has entered a stark new phase of aerial brutality, marked by a scale of retaliation previously unseen. In a coordinated overnight assault, Ukrainian forces launched a massive wave of over 130 drones against the Russian heartland, targeting the capital, Moscow, and multiple other regions in what appears to be the largest single drone offensive on Russian territory since the conflict began. The attack, described by Russian defense ministries as involving at least 134 unmanned aerial vehicles, caused significant disruption, with fires reported at several infrastructure sites and minor damage to buildings. This unprecedented barrage came in direct response to a severe Russian missile strike on Kyiv just hours earlier, which had targeted residential districts, killing at least 20 civilians and injuring dozens more in the worst attack on the Ukrainian capital in months. The reciprocal violence, executed with such volume and geographic spread, signifies a critical erosion of any remaining constraints, transforming the conflict into a war of mutual homeland punishment where major cities on both sides are now frontline targets. The technical execution of the Ukrainian drone swarm represents a monumental leap in capability and coordination. According to analyses of Russian Defense Ministry statements and local reports, the drones were launched from multiple vectors, striking targets across at least 6 regions, including Moscow, Leningrad, Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, and Krasnodar. In the capital, air defense systems were engaged throughout the night, with loud explosions rattling over the city as interceptors and electronic warfare teams sought to bring down the incoming threats. Several drones penetrated the defensive cordon, causing a fire at an electrical substation and damaging the facade of a government office building. The sheer number of drones overwhelmed local point defense systems, which are designed to handle smaller, more predictable incursions. This was not a precision strike on a single refinery, but a broad area saturation attack aimed at demonstrating that Ukraine can now threaten multiple high-value regions simultaneously. The drones used are believed to be a mix of long-range, fixed-wing models, similar to the Ukrainian-made UJ-22, and smaller, cheaper quadcopters, indicating a sophisticated logistical operation to assemble, program, and launch such a vast armada. The primary objectives appeared to be energy infrastructure, symbolic government targets, and the overarching goal of piercing the aura of inviolability that the Kremlin has sought to maintain around Moscow. Conversely, the Russian strike that precipitated this response was a classic demonstration of concentrated kinetic force. Utilizing a combination of hypersonic Kinjal missiles, cruise missiles, and Iranian-designed Shahed drones, Russian forces targeted Kyiv in the early morning hours, aiming at the city's power grid and devastatingly hitting residential apartment blocks. The attack left multi-story buildings in ruins, with rescue teams digging through rubble for survivors. Civilian casualties were high, including children, making it one of the deadliest single attacks on the capital in recent memory. This strike fit within Russia's established winter strategy of targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure to demoralize the population, but its particularly lethal impact on residential areas drew immediate and severe international condemnation. The timing and lethality suggested a deliberate escalation, possibly intended to crush Ukrainian morale ahead of an anticipated spring offensive or in retaliation for earlier Ukrainian successes. The stark civilian toll set the stage for the unprecedented Ukrainian response, moving Kyiv's targeting policy from primarily economic and military sites toward a more direct retaliation aimed at the nerve center of Russian political power. Globally, this exchange matters because it fundamentally alters risk calculations for the conflict and for international security. The demonstration of a capability to launch a 130-plus drone swarm moves the conflict into a realm of warfare that major militaries have long theorized about but rarely seen implemented at this scale by a non-state or smaller state actor. It proves that with sufficient ingenuity and decentralized production, a defending nation can manufacture and deploy a fleet of aerial vehicles capable of penetrating one of the world's most densely defended airspaces. This has immediate implications for security planners from Taiwan to NATO's eastern flank, as it validates the strategic potential of low-cost, mass drone warfare to negate traditional air defense advantages. Furthermore, the mutual strikes on capital cities normalize a level of escalation that the international community, particularly the United States and European powers, had long feared and sought to deter. The explicit tit-for-tat nature of the attack's residential bombing met with a swarm on the Capitol establishes a dangerous precedent for reciprocal urban targeting, reducing the threshold for what constitutes an acceptable retaliation and increasing the likelihood of miscalculation. The conflict is no longer a localized war in Eastern Europe, but a live laboratory for the future of hybrid and automated warfare, with lessons being absorbed in real time by global powers and non-state actors alike. Historically, this night of escalation finds its roots in the gradual erosion of red lines that has characterized the conflict since its outset. The initial stages of the full-scale invasion saw fighting concentrated in Ukraine's east and south. The first major shift occurred with the strike on the Kerch Bridge in October 2022, a symbolic blow to Russian infrastructure. This was followed by Ukraine's development of long-range strike capabilities, first targeting air bases in Russian-occupied Crimea, then refining capabilities to hit oil depots and refineries deep inside Russia proper. Each Ukrainian step was preceded by a Russian escalation. The indiscriminate bombing of Mariupol, the siege of Alexeyevka, the systematic attacks on the Ukrainian power grid. The attack on Kyiv's residential towers represents the latest grim iteration of Russia's bombardment strategy, while the 130-drone swarm is Ukraine's most audacious attempt to shift the cost-benefit calculus of that strategy. This cycle mirrors, in a modern, technology-driven context, the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, where the morale of the civilian population and the destruction of the homeland's economic capacity became explicit objectives. The historical parallel is the blurring of the line between frontline and home front, a line that has now been virtually erased, is less than, end of thinking, is greater than part two. The political implications within Russia are immediate and severe. For the Kremlin, the successful penetration of Moscow's air defenses by a swarm of drones is a profound embarrassment and a direct challenge to the narrative of martial competence and control. It exposes critical vulnerabilities in the layered defense system, protecting the political elite and the symbolic center of state power. This failure will inevitably lead to internal recriminations within the military and security services, likely resulting in dismissals and a further centralization of decision-making in the hands of those Putin trusts most. The political message to the Russian populace is contradictory. State media will frame the attack as an act of terrorist desperation, highlighting the effectiveness of air defenses in shooting down most of the drones, while simultaneously using the incident to justify a further tightening of security measures and perhaps a new wave of mobilization to feed the war machine. For the Ukrainian leadership, the swarm attack is a high-stakes demonstration of resolve and capability. It signals to its own people that it can and will deliver painful responses to Russian atrocities, potentially bolstering domestic morale. Internationally, it demonstrates that Ukraine is not a passive victim, but an active participant in shaping the conflict's escalation, a fact that complicates its diplomatic posture as it continues to appeal for more advanced weapons from allies who may fear further provoking Russia. Economically, the impact of the drone swarm, while less concentrated than a strike on a single refinery, contributes to a cumulative climate of instability that deters investment and imposes hidden costs. Each intercepted drone requires the launch of expensive surface-to-air missiles, depleting Russian stocks that are already under strain from the need to defend the front lines. The fires and disruptions at electrical substations can cause localized blackouts and production halts in sensitive industries. More broadly, the persistent threat of such swarms forces Russian businesses and the state to invest billions in point defense systems, electronic warfare upgrades, and physical hardening of infrastructure across a vast territory, a financial drain that competes with military production for resources. For Ukraine, the economic calculation is different. The drones represent a cost-effective means of imposing disproportionate psychological and defensive costs on Russia. While the financial toll of building and losing over 100 drones is significant for Ukraine's wartime economy, it is negligible compared to the value of the Russian assets it forces Moscow to expend or protect. This asymmetric economic warfare slowly bleeds Russian capacity, even as the immediate battlefield stalemate continues. The social consequences are deeply psychological on both sides. In Moscow and other Russian cities, the sound of air, defense artillery, and explosions, once a rare occurrence, is becoming normalized. This breeds a pervasive, low-grade anxiety among the urban population, eroding the sense of normalcy the state strives to project. While casualty numbers from the drone attacks remain low, the constant alerts and disruptions to sleep and daily routine contribute to war fatigue and a silent, gnawing questioning of the conflict's purpose and cost. In Ukraine, the devastating Russian strike on Kyiv's apartments reinforces a collective trauma and a hardening of resolve. The civilian deaths are not abstract statistics. They are neighbors, friends, and family, fueling a desire for both protection and retribution. The Ukrainian government's ability to launch a massive counterstrike provides a sense of agency and justice, however grim, but it also ties the population closer to the escalatory spiral, understanding that such Ukrainian actions may invite further Russian retaliation. Both societies are being conditioned to a new, horrific normal where war is not confined to the borders, but is a nightly possibility in their city centers. International reactions are sharply divided, reflecting the entrenched geopolitical blocs formed over the past 2 years. Western nations, including the United States and members of the European Union, condemned the Russian strike on Kyiv's residential areas in the strongest terms, citing it as evidence of Russia's disregard for international humanitarian law. Their response to the Ukrainian drone swarm was more measured, reiterating support for Ukraine's right to self-defense, while carefully avoiding any explicit endorsement of strikes on Russian cities. Behind the scenes, however, there is likely intense concern about the escalatory cycle and the potential for Russia to lash out in ways that could directly draw NATO into the conflict. In contrast, the Russian Foreign Ministry accused Ukraine of conducting a terrorist attack on civilian infrastructure and blamed the West for supplying the intelligence and technology enabling it. China and India, meanwhile, issued calls for an immediate de-escalation and a return to negotiations, reflecting their unease with a conflict that is destabilizing global security and economic frameworks. The incident hardens these positions, making diplomatic outreach even more difficult. Expert military analysis focuses on the swarm tactics as a watershed moment. Security analysts note that Ukraine has effectively implemented a form of distributed lethality, using numerous low-cost platforms to saturate and overwhelm a sophisticated integrated air defense system, IDES. This proves that even systems like the Russian Pantsir S-1 or S-400, designed to handle high-value aircraft and missiles, have critical weaknesses against low-altitude, low-radar signature drones arriving in large numbers. The lesson for global defense is clear. The future of aerial warfare and homeland defense will require a new tier of systems specifically designed for counter-unmanned aerial systems, CUAS, including directed energy weapons, networked sensor grids, and AI-driven threat prioritization. Furthermore, the operation showcased advanced coordination in command, control, and communications, as launching and managing the flight paths of over 130 drones across hundreds of kilometers required significant planning and resilience against Russian electronic countermeasures. For Russia, the failure suggests a dire need to adapt its defensive posture, but doing so while engaged in a massive land war will stretch its military technical resources to the limit. Looking forward, the immediate aftermath will see both sides preparing for the next round. Russia is certain to retaliate with another wave of missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, potentially employing even greater numbers to mirror the swarm tactic. It may also seek to target Ukraine's suspected drone manufacturing and storage sites with long-range precision weapons. Ukraine, having validated the swarm model, will work to scale production and develop even more capable drones, possibly with greater payloads or stealth characteristics. The international community faces a dilemma. Attempting to restrain Ukraine's right to retaliate risks undermining its sovereignty and defense, while providing the means for deeper strikes risks a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. The conflict has thus entered a dangerous new equilibrium of mutual strategic bombing, where the primary deterrent is no longer the threat of escalation, but the demonstrated capability to deliver it. The nights over Kyiv and Moscow are likely to grow louder, as the war's violence, increasingly automated and relentless, completes its inward spiral from the battlefield to the heart of each nation's daily life. Part 2. The political repercussions of this exchange are profound, reshaping the internal dynamics and international positioning of both nations. Within Russia, the Kremlin faces a dual challenge: managing the public perception of vulnerability while reinforcing its narrative of an existential struggle against the West. The failure to prevent such a large-scale penetration of Russian airspace, including the capital, is a severe blow to the reputation of the Ministry of Defense and the security services. It provides ammunition for internal critics, particularly from nationalist factions, who have long argued for a more total and ruthless war effort. The political establishment will likely respond not with introspection, but with a further consolidation of control, increased censorship regarding the effectiveness of air defenses, and a renewed push to frame the conflict as a fight for national survival that justifies any sacrifice. For President Vladimir Putin, whose legitimacy is deeply tied to promises of stability and restored national strength, the images of drones over Moscow are damaging. They undermine the central promise that life for most Russians can continue undisturbed by the special military operation. The response will be a hardening of rhetoric and, almost certainly, an order for retaliatory strikes of equivalent or greater scale, locking in a cycle of escalation that becomes increasingly difficult to control. In Ukraine, the political calculus behind the swarm attack is multifaceted. President Volodymyr Zelensky's government demonstrates to its citizens, particularly those in Kyiv, who endured the residential missile strikes, that it possesses both the capability and the will to deliver tangible retaliation. This is crucial for maintaining domestic morale and social cohesion amid immense suffering. Furthermore, it signals to international partners that Ukraine is not merely a passive recipient of aid, but an active, innovative belligerent capable of taking the initiative and striking strategic blows. This demonstration of agency is intended to bolster arguments for the continued and accelerated provision of long-range weapons such as ATACMS and F-16 fighter jets by proving that Ukraine can use such capabilities effectively and responsibly. However, it also places Kyiv in a delicate diplomatic position, as some allied nations may perceive the mass drone attack as a risky escalation that complicates their own cautious support. The Ukrainian leadership must balance the military and psychological necessity of such strikes with the geopolitical imperative of retaining broad international support. The social and psychological impact on civilian populations is perhaps the most insidious consequence of this new phase. For Muscovites, the experience of a mass drone raid transforms the war from a distant news item into a sensory reality. The disruption of sleep, the sound of explosions, the sight of interception trails in the night sky, and the temporary closures of airports and streets all contribute to a normalization of wartime anxiety in a city that has not known such sensations since World War II. This does not necessarily translate into anti-war sentiment. The state's media monopoly effectively channels fear into anger against Ukraine and the West, but it does breed a pervasive background stress that erodes quality of life and long-term confidence in the state's protective promise. In Ukrainian cities, the trauma is more direct and lethal. The Russian strike on residential buildings is a grim reminder that nowhere is safe, that a morning commute or a night's sleep at home can be shattered by a missile. This conditions a society to exist in a state of hypervigilance, where grief and rage become intertwined. The Ukrainian counterswarm offers a form of cathartic justice, but it also inextricably links the civilian populations of both nations in a shared, brutal experience of homeland attack, deepening the societal chasm and making future reconciliation even more abstract and distant. Internationally, the event forces a recalibration of positions. For NATO members, the drone swarm is a tactical revelation and a strategic concern. Military analysts will dissect the operation for insights into future warfare, while policymakers grapple with the escalated risks. The direct strike on Kyiv's apartments will intensify calls to further strengthen Ukraine's air defense umbrella, potentially accelerating deliveries of additional Patriot or SAMP-T systems. However, the scale of the Ukrainian retaliation may also trigger debates about escalation management, with some allies urging more behind-the-scenes pressure on Kyiv to avoid strikes on Moscow itself, fearing it could provoke irrational responses from the Kremlin. For non-aligned nations, the reciprocal attacks underscore the conflict's intractability. Countries like India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, which have sought to maintain relations with both sides, may see their space for mediation shrink further as the warfare becomes more total and less confined to the battlefield. The United Nations Security Council will witness another round of acrimonious but futile meetings, with resolutions condemned or vetoed, highlighting the body's paralysis in the face of a major conflict between a permanent member and a defending state. From an expert military and technological standpoint, the drone swarm attack represents a paradigm shift. It validates theories on the strategic utility of low-cost, mass-produced unmanned systems to overwhelm expensive, centralized air defenses. The Russian system, designed around the threat of NATO aircraft and missiles, proved ill-adapted to a cloud of small, slow, low-flying drones. This has immediate implications for global defense planning. Militaries worldwide will now prioritize developing layered counter-drone defenses, integrating radar, jammers, kinetic interceptors, and directed energy weapons. For the defense industry, the attack signals a booming market in both drone swarm technology and anti-swarm systems. Furthermore, the operation highlighted advanced operational concepts: decentralized command, where multiple cells launch drones autonomously; swarm intelligence, where drones may have shared targeting data; and resilience, as the loss of dozens of drones did not abort the mission. This demonstrates that Ukraine has successfully built a new branch of its military, a long-range drone force that operates alongside traditional artillery, armor, and infantry, giving it a unique asymmetric edge. Economically, the warfare of mutual bombardment imposes a continuous, draining cost. For Russia, every intercepted drone requires the expenditure of missile interceptors that are far more expensive than the drones themselves, an unsustainable cost-exchange ratio over time. The physical damage to infrastructure, while scattered, necessitates repair crews, spare parts, and production downtime. More significantly, the persistent attacks solidify Russia's status as a high-risk environment, scaring off any remaining foreign investment and encouraging capital flight among its own elite. For Ukraine, the economic calculation is one of survival. The resources poured into drone manufacturing are diverted from other needs, but are seen as a vital investment in imposing cost on the aggressor and in securing further Western financial aid by demonstrating effective use of resources. The attacks also have a global economic ripple. Targeting Russian energy infrastructure contributes to volatility in global oil and refined product markets, while the constant threat of escalation keeps insurance premiums high for shipping in the Black Sea region, affecting global grain and commodity prices. Looking forward, the immediate future is almost certain to contain an intensified rhythm of attack and counterattack. Russian military doctrine will demand a demonstrative response, likely involving even more massive missile and drone barrages aimed at overwhelming Ukrainian air defenses and crippling energy infrastructure anew. Ukraine will continue to refine its swarm tactics, increasing the numbers, range, and payload of its drones, potentially aiming for more strategic targets like command centers or critical manufacturing sites. The international community's role will be fraught. The provision of advanced air defense to Ukraine becomes even more critical to protect civilians, while simultaneously, allies may seek clandestine channels to communicate red lines and prevent actions that could trigger a wider war. The conflict has now firmly entered a stage of strategic bombardment, where the objective for both sides is to break the other's will and capacity to fight by making the homeland untenable. This is a dangerous and deeply destructive form of warfare with no quick resolution in sight. The events of this single night have erased the last vestiges of geographic limitation, binding the fates of Kyiv's apartment dwellers and Moscow's urbanites in a shared, terrifying narrative of 21st century war, where the front line is everywhere and the sky is no longer a sanctuary.